In the middle of World War II, soldiers began receiving letters from home that didn't feel right, too perfect, too personal, too cruel. Each one carried a secret meant to destroy them from within. Who was sending them, and how do they know so much about the men who received them? October 1943, North Africa. The desert wind carried sand through the tents of the American field post, mixing with the smell of ink and paper. Thousands of letters moved through the system every week. Lifelines from home, filled with jokes, promises, and pieces of a world worth fighting for. Among them, one man noticed something that didn't belong. Vincent Ross, a postal officer with the 5th Army, had seen every kind of letter. Cheerful ones, sad ones, even desperate ones. But lately, he'd begun to find a strange pattern buried in the stacks. Envelopes with no clear origin, return addresses that led nowhere. The paper felt too refined, the ink too exact. At first, it looked harmless. Then the content began to surface. Letters that spoke of betrayal, wives seen with another man, friends unable to tell the truth. Some included photographs, blurred images of women who looked just enough like someone's wife to plant a seed of doubt. Others carried newspaper clippings from small-town columns about marriages breaking under distance. Each one felt designed, deliberate. Ross began collecting the suspicious mail. He noticed how each message targeted a different soldier, but all shared the same structure: affection, then accusation. The handwriting changed, the towns changed, but the theme never did. And soon, the damage appeared. A sergeant tore open a letter, froze, and walked straight out of camp. Another man refused to eat for days. Rumors began to move faster than mail itself. Whispers about wives back home, faithfulness, lies. By the time Ross alerted his superiors, morale was shifting. Soldiers who had faced storms of fire on the front lines now faced storms inside their minds. When the intelligence team examined the letters, the truth started to take shape. The paper was not American. The texture, ink density, and postal seals all pointed to European manufacture. The printing on the photographs matched no U.S. presses. Even the tone of the writing felt slightly foreign, the phrasing almost American, but not quite. That was the first clue. These weren't personal letters. They were weapons. Someone had studied American language, humor, and emotion, then used it against them. Every word was chosen to hit a nerve: loneliness, jealousy, fear. It was psychological warfare. Ross's discovery reached military intelligence headquarters within days. Reports came in from Italy, England, and the Pacific. Soldiers everywhere were receiving similar letters, some almost identical in phrasing. The campaign was not isolated. It was coordinated. Inside the War Department, analysts began cross-checking the envelopes. They found coded identifiers hidden within the postal routes. Some letters had been mailed from neutral countries like Switzerland and Portugal, others from seemingly random addresses inside occupied Europe. It was precise, professional, and planned long before the first letter was ever sent. The goal wasn't to break armies, it was to fracture belief, to make every soldier doubt the one thing that kept him steady, the idea that someone back home still waited for him. And it was working. In one report, a company chaplain described men lining up at his tent not for confession, but for confirmation, wanting reassurance their wives hadn't forgotten them. Another officer wrote that his men were alert, armed, and distracted by ghosts. What no one could prove yet was who was behind it, but the fingerprints were there, the structure too organized, the psychology too advanced. Behind the front lines, the letters became a silent enemy. They required no sound, no confrontation, just a whisper on paper. As the Allied campaign moved deeper into Europe, Ross continued forwarding samples to investigators. Each envelope, each photograph, each forged clipping became a fragment of something larger, a web reaching across borders and battlefields. Then came the turning point. A report from Washington confirmed that similar letters had been intercepted by naval mail sensors in the Pacific. The handwriting, the wording, even the emotional rhythm matched those found in North Africa. It was now clear this wasn't a rumor or coincidence. It was a coordinated psychological strike against the American military family. Someone was attacking the human side of war, the trust between a soldier and his home. And that discovery changed everything. From that moment, a new kind of battle began. One fought not with weapons, but with words. Intelligence officers began tracing the origins of the deception, leading to a chilling revelation. A propaganda division in Germany had been studying American culture for years, waiting for the right time to strike. Ross never saw the full scope of what he uncovered, but his attention to detail, one postal officer noticing what others missed, opened the first door into a war that couldn't be mapped or measured. A war fought in silence, through envelopes, ink, and lies. The letter that started it all wasn't a message from home. It was the first shot in an invisible campaign, one that aimed not at soldiers' bodies, but at their hearts. And in the months to come, the enemy would only get bolder. Long before the first false letter reached the desert in 1943, the foundation for this psychological offensive had already been laid in Berlin. Inside a tall gray building along Wilhelmstrasse, Joseph Goebbels had turned propaganda into science. His Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda didn't just print posters or control the news. It dissected human belief itself. Every broadcast, every leaflet, every rumor was part of a calculated system. By 1942, a new branch within the ministry had emerged, one that would study enemy morale with almost academic precision. The name, in German, translated simply as Psychological Warfare Division, but inside it was known by a code name, Operation Seduction. Its goal was not to terrify Americans, but to unravel them. Goebbels' analysts believed that Americans were deeply sentimental, loyal to family, idealistic about love, but prone to jealousy. They studied how American soldiers wrote home, what they missed, what they feared. The ministry's cultural experts collected U.S. magazines, small-town newspapers, even advice columns and church bulletins. They mapped emotional vulnerabilities like military targets. The division began building detailed profiles of the American home front, what towns looked like, what newspapers they read, what social pressures shaped their marriages. They knew that distance could erode trust, and war made that distance unbearable. So, they decided to weaponize it. Operation Seduction focused on one weakness that no helmet could protect: loneliness. The first step was data. German intelligence operatives scoured captured mail, intercepted Red Cross messages, and mined shipping records for soldiers' names and hometowns. Every fragment of personal information became ammunition. Some names came from public sources, local newsletters, casualty lists, even U.S. Census records. Others were stolen through espionage, drawn from Allied communication lines that were not yet fully secure. By late 1943, the propaganda ministry had everything it needed: real identities, real addresses, and an endless supply of forged sentiment. From this, the letters were born. They were printed in small workshops throughout occupied Europe, in Hamburg, Vienna, and especially in Paris, where captured American typewriters were used to mimic authentic text. Each letter was tailored to its recipient. Some appeared to come from a worried neighbor, others from anonymous friends back home. A few were far more elaborate, complete with printed photographs, fake telegrams, and fabricated court notices. It wasn't random cruelty, it was engineering. Every detail was tested for credibility. The paper stock was selected to mimic American stationery. The return addresses were based on real towns, often chosen from census lists of soldiers' home states. Even the emotional tone of each letter followed a pattern designed by psychologists, opening with warmth, pivoting to uncertainty, ending with heartbreak. It was the perfect formula for mental corrosion. But letters weren't the only weapon. Radio joined the assault. Across occupied Europe, programs like Radio Stuttgart and Radio Calais began broadcasting in English. Their female announcers, calm, sympathetic, and distinctly American-sounding, became infamous under names like Axis Sally and Midge at the microphone. They spoke directly to Allied soldiers. "You boys must miss your girls back home. Have you heard from them lately? Some of them are keeping warm with new friends." The words were always soft, never shouted. A whisper meant to plant seeds of doubt that would grow in silence. Each broadcast was paired with the letter's arrival schedule. Soldiers would hear the suggestion on the radio, then days later receive evidence in the mail. The synchronization was not coincidence, it was choreography. Behind every broadcast, a team of linguists, cultural experts, and psychologists reviewed scripts line by line. Their mission wasn't to humiliate the enemy, but to confuse him, to make him question the loyalty of the world he was fighting for. Inside Germany's propaganda ministry, reports poured in. Analysts measured success not by territory gained, but by emotions provoked. Whenever American field intelligence reported a spike in desertion, depression, or disciplinary issues, the ministry noted it as a psychological strike achieved. One internal document, later recovered by Allied investigators, summarized it coldly. "The American soldier fights not for country, but for home. Therefore, make him believe home no longer waits." And it worked more often than anyone dared to admit. By the spring of 1944, the network was expanding. Neutral countries like Switzerland, Sweden, and Portugal became staging grounds. Their postal neutrality made them perfect conduits for forged letters. Some mailbags were even slipped into legitimate Allied postal shipments by paid intermediaries. Diplomats, traders, even Red Cross contacts who never knew what they were carrying. The deeper the Allies advanced on the battlefield, the more the propaganda spread behind them. German intelligence called it the invisible counterattack. As tanks rolled toward Europe, the ministry rolled out letters, broadcasts, and photographs in equal volume. Every soldier who hesitated, every man who doubted, was seen as a small victory. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Goebbels personally monitored the reports. He considered propaganda a more potent weapon than bombs. His speeches to staff often began the same way. "We do not need to break their lines, we need to break their hearts." To achieve this, the ministry's psychologists borrowed from modern advertising research. They studied American marketing methods, the same ones used to sell soap and cigarettes, and applied them to human emotion. They called it emotive inversion, turning affection into anxiety, loyalty into fear. It was manipulation at its most precise. The results were chilling. Soldiers began arriving at field hospitals with exhaustion, anxiety, and sudden withdrawal from comrades. Letters from wives went unanswered. Commanders noted dips in morale without understanding why. For the first time in modern history, emotion itself had become a battlefield. Every photograph, every whisper, every printed lie, each was part of a strategy to make truth uncertain. And yet, hidden within this operation was a flaw, a detail the Germans had overlooked. The very precision that made the letters convincing also made them traceable. Paper fibers, ink composition, printing alignment. When U.S. counterintelligence officers later examined captured samples, these technical fingerprints would lead them straight to the workshops where Operation Seduction had been born. But that discovery was still months away. For now, the enemy's deception was spreading freely, invisible, unstoppable, and devastatingly effective. Behind every envelope that reached a lonely soldier, there was a typewriter in Berlin, a printer in Paris, a radio voice in Stuttgart, and an architect of lies who believed this was a new kind of victory. And in the silence between battles, when men stared too long at letters from home, that victory felt dangerously close. But the Americans were beginning to notice, not just in mailrooms, but in their own growing unease. something was wrong, and the evidence was stacking up. Soon, one man, a counterintelligence officer named Peter Manning, would follow the paper trail straight into the heart of this unseen war. And what he uncovered would expose a system more intricate, more calculated, and more ruthless than anyone could have imagined.
Spring 1944. Across Europe, the war was shifting, and so was its shadow. The battles moved north, the skies filled with aircraft. And beneath the chaos of noise and fire, a quieter weapon continued its work: the letters. They arrived everywhere now, in North Africa, in Italy, in England, even in the islands of the Pacific. Each one carried the same undertone of betrayal, the same subtle precision that Vincent Ross had uncovered months earlier. What began as a trickle had become a tide. Soldiers called them the whispers. Some arrived neatly folded in standard envelopes. Others came disguised as telegrams or typed notes from anonymous friends back home. Some even included photographs, glossy prints showing women in civilian dresses standing beside unfamiliar men. Many looked real, some were real, but most were carefully fabricated, faces rearranged, bodies replaced, smiles edited by hands that understood the fragile mechanics of trust. And it worked. In camps and tents, rumors began to move faster than the mail itself. Stories spread of wives who couldn't wait, of families falling apart while the men were away. The words turned into anxiety, then into anger. Reports from field officers showed an unsettling pattern: more disciplinary actions, more psychological breakdowns, and a growing number of soldiers refusing to open their mail at all. Letters, once the lifeline of a soldier, had become an object of fear. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, later recovered by historians, "We dread the mail truck now. It used to bring life. Now it brings ghosts."
The campaign had reached full strength. The timing was no coincidence. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, the German propaganda machine intensified its psychological assault. Radio broadcasts echoed across enemy lines every night, voices that sounded calm, compassionate, familiar. "Your wives are dancing in Chicago tonight," one announcer murmured over Radio Stuttgart, "and you're still here, alone in the desert." Another voice from Radio Calais spoke directly to the soldiers awaiting D-Day. "They say you fight for freedom, but while you fight, someone else is keeping your home warm." The effect was devastating. Even the most disciplined men couldn't completely ignore the whispers. The propaganda was never shouted. It was designed to feel personal, believable enough to feed the quiet fears that already existed. In hospitals and field clinics, military doctors began seeing new patterns of stress. Men who had fought bravely for months were now distracted, unfocused, their thoughts thousands of miles away. Some became reckless in battle, acting as if life no longer held meaning. Others withdrew completely, sitting for hours with unread letters in their hands. A few simply vanished, walking off into the night, trying to find a way home. Military psychiatrists reported a surge in what they called war weariness with emotional displacement. Behind the clinical words was a simpler truth. Too many men were breaking under the weight of doubt. By mid-1944, the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps had enough evidence to confirm what they feared. The psychological war had reached its peak. The letters were being distributed through neutral channels, but also slipped into legitimate mail streams by infiltrators and collaborators. Each one was a calculated strike, and as the Allied forces advanced, the deception advanced with them. In Italy, soldiers stationed near Naples began receiving letters that appeared to come from their own hometowns, some with matching handwriting, others with exact postal stamps. In England, airmen training for D-Day found photographs of their wives in London clubs. In the Pacific, sailors received clippings of supposed newspaper articles describing engagements broken off back home. None of it could be easily dismissed. The details were too convincing.
The poison spread further when the propaganda found its way back to America itself. Some wives began receiving anonymous letters, written in English, claiming that their husbands had taken comfort overseas. The words were cruel and vague, but enough to stir fear in families already stretched thin by distance and uncertainty. One recorded case came from Ohio. A woman named Margaret Lawson received a package containing a photograph of a soldier with a woman in uniform beside him, along with a note claiming her husband had died with the woman's name on his lips. Her husband, alive and fighting in Italy, didn't know of it until months later. By then, her world had already collapsed. That was the true genius and cruelty of the campaign. It attacked both ends of the emotional chain, the soldier and the home. And yet, despite its success, the campaign was not invisible anymore. The Americans were watching. Intelligence officers began collecting samples and tracing postal patterns. They noticed that certain letters shared identical phrasing or matching typewriter markings. The web of deception had a center, and they intended to find it. But for the soldiers on the front lines, the damage had already been done. Camaraderie began to erode. Distrust crept into quiet conversations. Even simple laughter around the campfire sometimes fell flat, as if everyone was holding a question they couldn't ask aloud. Who could you believe when lies looked like love letters?
By the summer of 1944, the campaign had reached what historians now call the psychological saturation point. The propaganda had touched nearly every American frontline division in Europe and countless families back home. But the turning point was coming. In July, a memo reached the War Department in Washington. It contained a list of evidence, intercepted letters, forged images, recordings of Axis broadcasts, all pointing toward the same conclusion. This was not random. This was systemic. The United States was under a coordinated psychological assault, and the battlefield was the human mind. The intelligence community knew it had to respond, because if words could tear apart a soldier's faith in home, they could also be used to rebuild it. That realization marked the beginning of America's counterstrike, one that would soon expose the network behind the lies and turn the weapon of propaganda back on its creators. The poison had spread far, but its reach had finally been traced. And at the center of the web, waiting in the dark, was a man who believed he had found the perfect way to break an army without ever firing a shot. The Americans were about to prove him wrong.
While soldiers fought across Europe, another battle had begun thousands of miles away. A war that no one saw coming, fought not with weapons, but with paper, ink, and doubt. By late 1944, strange letters began showing up across small American towns. They looked harmless at first, handwritten envelopes, postmarked from cities people recognized. But their words carried the same poison that had already seeped through military mail in Europe. Only this time, the target was home. Wives of soldiers overseas began receiving anonymous messages. Some came folded neatly, others wrapped in small parcels. The tone was always the same, subtle, sympathetic, and cruel. "You deserve to know," one letter read. "He's been seen with a nurse in Italy. There are photos, but it's better if you don't ask." The writing was almost gentle, but the damage was immediate. Women gathered in neighborhoods, sharing their fears in whispers. Some tried to dismiss the letters as lies. Others couldn't shake the dread. The war had already taken so much: sons, husbands, fathers, and now it threatened the one thing left: trust. Rumors spread through factory floors and church halls. Did you hear what happened to Nancy's husband? Did you see what came in the mail? The propaganda had crossed the ocean, and small towns like Dayton, Omaha, and Mobile, anonymous packages arrived containing staged photographs, soldiers in uniform smiling beside European women. Some images were real, taken from social clubs or hospitals, but the faces had been changed. A soldier's name scrawled on the back gave it all the credibility it needed. In Ohio, Margaret Lawson received one of those packages. Inside was a photograph of a soldier with another woman and a note that said her husband had died in her arms. Margaret collapsed before she could read the second page. a forged death notice printed on imitation government stationery. Weeks later, she learned her husband was alive. He never knew what had nearly broken her. Cases like hers multiplied across the country. The letters arrived through neutral postal routes, sometimes routed through Canada or South America to disguise their origin. No one understood how so many addresses had been obtained. Later, investigators would discover the answer: intercepted Red Cross messages, stolen mailing lists, and open-source public directories used with devastating precision. The propaganda had evolved into something larger than deception. It was now an emotional siege. Communities began to fracture. Some women stopped attending church for fear of gossip. Others quit their jobs in factory foundries after receiving letters implying their husbands were ashamed of them. The psychological attack was exploiting America's wartime tensions. Women entering the workforce, men far away, families divided by distance and uncertainty. The Germans had studied those very changes years earlier. Now they were using them. One intelligence report from the Office of War Information described the campaign as an attempt to reverse American morale by turning love into liability. The enemy no longer needed to plant spies in every town. The seeds of mistrust were doing the work themselves. Even the newspapers felt the tremors. Columns about wartime loneliness became more common. Radio hosts reminded listeners to trust their hearts, not their fears. Churches organized letter-writing nights, urging families to send messages of faith and unity. But the unease kept spreading. For every letter written in hope, there seemed to be another written in malice. In several cases, entire neighborhoods turned against women who were accused, often falsely, of moving on too quickly. The propaganda wasn't just attacking marriages, it was dividing communities. Wartime America had become a landscape of quiet suspicion. The enemy's campaign had achieved something remarkable. It made the most ordinary parts of life feel dangerous. The postman's knock became a sound of dread. The Daily Mail, once a comfort, became a threat. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began receiving reports from across the country: anonymous letters, strange packages, envelopes without fingerprints. Agents suspected foreign interference but lacked the evidence to connect the dots. The propaganda was too cleverly disguised as domestic gossip. Meanwhile, the families themselves were breaking. Some couples divorced based solely on what they received. Others simply stopped writing altogether, trapped in silence, unsure what to believe. And yet, even amid the chaos, acts of resilience began to appear. In New York, a group of women formed an informal network called the Waiting Wives. They wrote collectively to reassure each other and to their husbands that no rumor or letter could undo their loyalty. Their notes would later be quoted by historians as examples of America's moral resistance in the face of manipulation. But not everyone found that strength. For soldiers reading genuine letters from home, trust became complicated. Every real message risked being seen as fake. Every heartfelt sentence questioned. The propaganda had achieved its darkest victory. It had made truth indistinguishable from lies. By the winter of 1944, the War Department finally acknowledged the full scope of the problem. The attacks were not isolated, not random, and not accidental. They were systematic. Behind the headlines about advancing troops, a new kind of battle was forming. One that demanded investigators, linguists, and code experts instead of soldiers. The enemy had opened a psychological front, and the United States would have to respond. The following month, the Army's Counterintelligence Corps launched a classified investigation to trace the origins of the letters. Their mission was simple: find the source and shut it down. The man chosen to lead that mission was Peter Manning, an experienced field investigator known for his precision and composure under pressure.
He had no idea that what he was about to uncover would expose one of the most sophisticated information warfare networks of the entire conflict. The propaganda had reached its peak. Now America was preparing to fight back.
January 1945. The war in Europe was reaching its climax, but in Washington, another front had opened, one made of paper, lies, and human emotion. Stacks of intercepted letters covered the desks inside a nondescript government building on G Street. They looked ordinary, the same creased envelopes that carried millions of messages every week, but to trained eyes, these were evidence. At the center of the investigation stood Peter Manning, an officer of the Army Counterintelligence Corps. He was meticulous, methodical, and unshaken by confusion. The kind of man who noticed patterns others missed. When the first files crossed his desk, he recognized it immediately. The letters were not isolated hoaxes, they were a network. His task was simple on paper: find where the letters came from. But beneath that simplicity lay a challenge unlike any the Corps had faced. Each envelope carried clues: paper stock, ink viscosity, typewriter font, postal routing codes, and each clue pointed somewhere different. Some letters were mailed through neutral Switzerland, others through Sweden or Portugal. A few appeared to have been slipped directly into Allied mailbags somewhere along the line. Manning began assembling a small team of linguists, document analysts, and postal experts. They operated under quiet orders: no public exposure, no leaks to the press. The goal was containment. Their first discovery came through chemistry. Under magnification, analysts identified the paper fibers as coming from a European pulp blend, commonly used in German and Austrian printing. The ink contained traces of iron sulfate, not typical of American manufacturers. The printing on several photographs matched equipment used in occupied France. The conclusion was clear. The letters had a single origin, spread across multiple points of distribution.
But there was more. A forensic analyst in London noticed something subtle: a recurring misalignment in the typewriter print used on several envelopes. The defect was identical on mail recovered in both Italy and England. That meant the letters had been produced in batches on the same machine somewhere in Europe. Through diplomatic back channels, Manning coordinated with British intelligence. The evidence converged on a disturbing truth. German propaganda units were operating mail networks through neutral cities, laundering forged correspondence into Allied systems using local intermediaries. One of those intermediaries, a Portuguese printer named Álvaro Sousa, unknowingly provided a critical lead. His company had been paid to reproduce American-style pamphlets in English, supposedly for humanitarian relief. But the font samples matched the fake letters exactly. Manning's team followed the trail from Lisbon to Hamburg, tracing payments through shell companies and front organizations. Each layer of deception revealed another, a system designed not just to spread lies, but to hide its own existence. Then came the real breakthrough. While examining intercepted Red Cross communications, Manning discovered that certain care packages sent to soldiers had been delayed or tampered with. The handwriting on customs labels didn't match the originals. Someone had been intercepting humanitarian mail, copying personal information, and returning the parcels, seemingly untouched. Cross-referencing the addresses revealed a chilling pattern. Every soldier whose mail had been compromised later received one of the fabricated infidelity letters. The enemy had found their source of truth. The Red Cross, a neutral lifeline in the war, had become an unwitting conduit for psychological warfare. The revelation stunned Washington. What had begun as propaganda now bordered on espionage. The Germans were not simply forging names, they were harvesting genuine personal details, turning compassion into intelligence. Manning knew the implications. If the enemy could reach into the Red Cross, nothing was safe.
The next step was containment. He recommended immediate countermeasures:
secure verification seals for all outbound and inbound mail, coded identifiers for legitimate military correspondence, and a central registry of soldier addresses to prevent duplication. But he also knew defensive action alone wasn't enough. To stop the attacks, he had to strike back. Through captured records and intercepted transmissions, Manning pieced together the operational structure of the propaganda network. It centered around a hub codenamed Station H, located in Berlin and coordinated through radio transmitters in Stuttgart and Vienna. From there, batches of false correspondence were dispatched via diplomatic pouches to Lisbon, Stockholm, and Zurich, where agents remailed them into Allied channels. Neutral couriers handled the rest, often without realizing what they carried. Some were journalists, others businessmen. A few were American expatriates who had chosen the wrong side. As the investigation deepened, Manning uncovered another layer: domestic collaborators. Several of the letters used slang and phrasing so authentically American that they couldn't have been written overseas. A small group of U.S. citizens living in Europe before the war had been recruited to craft the text. Some were blackmailed, others were ideologues. All were invisible participants in the enemy's psychological campaign. Manning read their recovered instructions with a cold sense of disbelief. They were told to mimic genuine affection, to study love letters and family notes, to learn the rhythm of American speech. Their work was meant to sound human, because that's what made it dangerous. By spring, the investigation had reached its limit. The evidence was overwhelming, but physical arrests inside neutral territories were nearly impossible without diplomatic fallout. Manning's team turned instead to counteroffense. They called it Operation Family Shield.
The plan was bold: expose the lies publicly while secretly feeding false information back through the same propaganda channels. If the enemy wanted to weaponize emotion, the Americans would use truth and deception in return. But before that operation could begin, Manning wanted proof. Undeniable, documented proof of the network's existence. That proof arrived in April 1945, when a shipment of forged letters was intercepted in France. The crates contained thousands of envelopes, all addressed to U.S. soldiers, each stamped and sealed, ready for distribution. Inside the top crate, under layers of straw, lay a folder labeled Psychological Kriegsführung, Operation S. Inside were memos, production logs, and photographs of the printing rooms, including lists of American names and addresses copied line by line from intercepted mail. It was the confirmation Manning needed. The invisible war was no longer invisible. He filed his final report that week. His conclusion was simple but chilling. The enemy has discovered that paper can wound deeper than steel. The counterweapon must therefore be truth, delivered faster and guarded better. Within days, Washington approved the full deployment of Operation Family Shield. The Americans would answer deception with exposure, and for the first time, turn the psychological war back on the propagandists who had started it. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was reaching its final phase, but inside intelligence offices across Washington, a different kind of campaign was just beginning. The enemy had turned words into weapons. Now America would learn to fight with them too. They called it Operation Family Shield. Its purpose was simple in theory but monumental in execution: to protect the emotional connection between soldiers and their families, and to dismantle the propaganda system that had poisoned it. Peter Manning's investigation had revealed the mechanism. Now it was time to reverse it. Within days of his report, the War Department and the Office of War Information convened in a closed meeting. Around that table sat experts from communications, psychology, intelligence, and public affairs, all faced with the same question: how do you defend the truth when lies arrive faster than letters? The answer came from an unexpected source: the soldiers themselves. Field surveys showed that men trusted authenticity over reassurance. They didn't want to be told everything was fine. They wanted proof. So Operation Family Shield began by creating a new system for verifying legitimate mail from home. Every letter sent through official military channels now carried a coded verification mark, invisible to the sender, but traceable through a central system. Soldiers could confirm their mail's authenticity through chaplains or commanding officers. For the first time, propaganda could be filtered out before it reached the front lines. Next came communication. The U.S. government realized that silence was the enemy's greatest ally. The Germans thrived on confusion and secrecy, so America decided to expose the truth loudly, publicly, and systematically. The Office of War Information launched a series of radio segments and military publications explaining how enemy propaganda operated. Without revealing classified details, they showed soldiers and civilians alike the anatomy of deception, how fake letters were made, how neutral postal systems were exploited, and how radio broadcasts used psychological manipulation to plant ideas. The goal was not just defense, but education. Soldiers began attending briefings led by military chaplains and morale officers. They were shown examples of falsified letters, forged photographs, and the radio scripts that had targeted them. Once the mechanism was visible, the illusion lost its power. Manning watched the transformation unfold in the reports coming from overseas. Soldiers who once tore open envelopes in fear were now reading their letters with confidence. The weapon of doubt had been disarmed, not by censorship, but by understanding. On the home front, the operation expanded further. Eleanor Roosevelt, a powerful voice of reassurance, addressed the nation in one of her wartime radio programs. Without naming specifics, she spoke of a campaign of deceit aimed at our families and urged Americans to trust not the letter that brings pain, but the heart that brings faith. Her words were carried on every major network, echoing into millions of homes. Across the country, community centers and town halls hosted meetings on war information awareness. Speakers from the Office of War Information explained how the enemy was trying to divide American families and why unity was the strongest defense. Mail verification posters appeared in post offices, urging citizens to check the authenticity of any suspicious letters or photographs. Newspapers published short guides titled, "How to Spot a Fake." The propaganda war was finally being fought in daylight. Meanwhile, Manning and his team weren't done. Operation Family Shield also had a covert side, one designed to strike back directly. Using the same neutral postal networks that the Germans had exploited, the Americans created a controlled flow of false correspondence, bait letters meant to draw the enemy out. Each letter was crafted to look vulnerable, personal, emotional, and full of information worth stealing. Hidden within were subtle tracing markers, chemical signatures in the ink, unique folds in the paper, and coded phrases detectable only through intelligence analysis. The bait worked. Within weeks, several of the fake letters reappeared in intercepted propaganda broadcasts, proving that the Germans were still monitoring the channels. But now, every intercepted message gave the Americans a trail. Manning's analysts traced these patterns to a cell operating out of Lisbon, a city long used as a hub for neutral trade and covert communication. Through diplomatic cooperation, Allied intelligence began monitoring shipments from Lisbon's postal warehouses. What they discovered confirmed everything. Crates of forged correspondence, destined for Europe, bearing fake American return addresses. Each crate was another piece of the puzzle. Back in Washington, the discoveries strengthened the public campaign. Newspapers cautiously began reporting on enemy attempts to tamper with morale. Rather than instilling fear, the transparency united the country. Families became vigilant, soldiers became aware, and the propaganda's emotional power began to collapse. In one morale survey conducted that summer, 87% of American soldiers said they trusted their families more than before. The numbers told the story. The psychological tide was turning. But Operation Family Shield was not just about defense. It was about message. The propaganda war had attacked love, loyalty, and family. So the response centered on the same values. Posters showed images of reunited families, honest letters, and phrases like "truth travels home." Radio plays dramatized real letters between soldiers and their wives, reminding audiences that faith was the strongest link between front and home. And behind every broadcast, every pamphlet, every line of counter-propaganda was the same principle that Manning had written in his final report. The weapon of deceit cannot survive exposure to light. By late 1945,
Intercepted reports from Berlin confirmed what the Americans already suspected. The enemy's psychological campaign had unraveled. Soldiers no longer believed the rumors. Wives no longer feared the letters. And the propaganda divisions that once celebrated emotional victories now recorded only silence. But for Manning, victory wasn't measured in intercepted mail or broken networks. It was measured in trust, restored, repaired, and guarded. He knew the war of words had revealed something deeper than military strategy. It had shown how fragile truth could be, and how strong it could become when defended collectively. The letters that once tore soldiers apart were now being studied, cataloged, and archived, not as tools of destruction, but as lessons. Operation Family Shield had done more than stop a campaign. It had proven that even in an age of deception, the truth could still fight back and win. Yet in the quiet halls of the intelligence office, Manning knew something else. This kind of war would never truly end. The methods would change, the mediums would evolve, but the battle for belief, the war for trust, would continue into every generation that followed. Still, for that moment, America had reclaimed its voice. The lies had been exposed, the poison neutralized, and the letters that once carried doubt now served as reminders of resilience. The propaganda war wasn't over yet, but its direction had changed, and for the first time, it favored the truth. Across the war-torn capitals of Europe, German authority was collapsing. But within its ruins, one last network still pulsed, silent, hidden, and dangerous. Operation Family Shield had cornered it. For Peter Manning and his counterintelligence team, months of tracing postal routes and radio frequencies were about to reach their end. Intercepted transmissions from Lisbon, Zurich, and Vienna now converged toward a single location, a communication center in neutral territory, moving vast amounts of forged correspondence through diplomatic pouches. The investigation had gone from paper and ink to people and names. The diplomatic pressure was immense. Arresting agents in neutral nations risked international outrage, yet the evidence was too strong to ignore. The Americans coordinated quietly with British and Portuguese authorities, agreeing on a single night when simultaneous actions would unfold. A network dismantled in one coordinated sweep. They called it the January Raids. When the signal came, it wasn't dramatic. A single coded telegram reached Manning's desk at dawn. Cargo secured. By dusk, several facilities across neutral Europe had been searched under diplomatic authority. What they found confirmed everything, and more than anyone imagined. In a storage room behind an import office near Lisbon's harbor, investigators uncovered filing cabinets stacked to the ceiling. Inside were thousands of American names, addresses, and personal details. Wives' birthdays, children's ages, even descriptions of family houses. Every file had been drawn from intercepted correspondence or stolen welfare records. Each card represented a life studied, analyzed, and weaponized. There were also photographs, hundreds of them, used as models for forged letters. Some were taken from captured photo albums, others staged in German studios to look American. And then came the most disturbing discovery: full training manuals written by German psychological officers. Each page detailed how to compose messages of heartbreak and despair. One section instructed propagandists to mirror the rhythm of American conversation, never insult, only imply. Another explained how to blend real information with falsehoods. The smallest truth makes the largest lie believable. The scope of the operation stunned even hardened intelligence officers. In another site in Vienna, Allied agents recovered reels of recorded radio programs, broadcasts of Axis Sally, and other English-speaking announcers. Each script was cross-referenced with mailing schedules. The broadcasts and the letters had been synchronized to arrive within days of each other, maximizing psychological effect. This was not improvisation. It was a system, industrial, scientific, and terrifyingly organized. Among the captured documents were payment ledgers listing dozens of collaborators. Some were local printers, others were translators, typists, and couriers. A handful were Americans, former journalists and expatriates who had traded their language for influence or money. The interrogations began quietly under diplomatic cover. One name appeared again and again: Wilhelm Brenner, a senior propaganda officer attached to Goebbels' ministry. He had supervised morale operations across Europe since 1941 and now coordinated the remnants of Operation Seduction. Brenner was captured outside Zurich while attempting to destroy communication records. When questioned, he spoke with chilling calm. To him, there was nothing immoral about his work. He described it as warfare of the mind. "You Americans fight with machines," he said to the interrogators. "We fight with emotions. It is more elegant." Manning listened to the transcript later that night, seated in a dark office surrounded by boxes of evidence. Brenner's words echoed like a confession and a warning. The operation's post-analysis confirmed Brenner's boast. The propaganda had been scientifically measured. Ministry reports calculated morale degradation rates based on intercepted Allied radio chatter and psychiatric case summaries. They tracked which types of lies caused the greatest despair, which voices drew the highest listener trust, and which emotional triggers caused hesitation on the battlefield. It was a study of humanity turned against itself. When the findings reached Washington, the tone of intelligence briefings changed. This was no longer about countering one campaign. It was about understanding a new kind of warfare altogether. The documents revealed that Germany had begun preparing psychological operations years before the war, building archives of foreign press clippings and social data. The propaganda letters were merely the final weapon in a strategy conceived long before the first shot of the war. The revelations left a mark on everyone who read them. Among the files, Manning found something unexpected: a handwritten note from one of the captured typists, addressed to no one in particular. It read, "We were told this was harmless, that words could not wound. Now I see the faces in these photographs. They are not enemies, they are people." The words struck Manning more deeply than he expected. It was proof that even within the machinery of lies, conscience had survived somewhere. When the January raids concluded, hundreds of thousands of documents were secured. The propaganda pipeline collapsed overnight. No more forged letters appeared on Allied fronts. The radio broadcasts continued briefly, but their credibility had already evaporated. Still, the damage had been done. The numbers told a sobering story. More than 10,000 American soldiers had filed reports of emotional distress directly linked to propaganda exposure. Dozens of families had separated or suffered lasting trauma. Manning wrote in his after-action summary, "The cost of deception cannot be measured by victories prevented, but by trust destroyed." As Europe edged toward liberation, his team prepared the final dossiers for post-war tribunals. The evidence, the letters, the files, the recordings, would later appear at intelligence hearings and propaganda trials in Nuremberg. For the first time, psychological warfare would be recognized as a legitimate weapon of conflict. In the weeks that followed, the remnants of Brenner's network were dismantled. Printing presses were confiscated, transmitters dismantled, and archives sealed for study. The invisible war had reached its breaking point and ended not with explosions, but with signatures on confiscation orders. When Manning finally walked through the warehouse where the seized material was stored, he paused before one wooden crate. Inside were the earliest letters, the ones found by Vincent Ross in North Africa nearly 2 years before. The ink had faded, the paper brittle, but the handwriting still whispered the same quiet betrayal. He closed the lid and marked it for transfer to the archives. For every forged letter that had carried doubt, there were now shelves of evidence carrying truth. The enemy's greatest weapon, secrecy, had been taken away. Operation Seduction was over. But as Manning stepped out into the cold evening air, he knew the victory was incomplete. The tactics would return someday. Different form, different medium, same purpose. For now, though, America had broken the silence that once haunted its soldiers. The lies had been captured. The architects unmasked, and the truth, at last, had the final word. When the last propaganda station went silent, the war of words was finally over. But silence didn't bring peace. Not yet. For thousands of American families, the end of the campaign didn't erase the damage it had done. It only revealed it. Across the country, letters that once seemed harmless now carried invisible weight. In homes from Kansas to California, wives and husbands tried to piece together trust that had been fractured by deception. Some never could. In Ohio, Margaret Lawson, the woman whose forged letter had nearly destroyed her marriage, reunited with her husband that summer. He returned thinner, quieter, his hands still trembling from months on the front. She showed him the photograph that had shattered her world, still folded inside a drawer. They never spoke of it again. Historians would later write that her case was one of hundreds. Marriages had fallen apart not because of infidelity, but because of suggestion, the quiet poison of belief. In military hospitals across Europe, chaplains and psychiatrists met men who couldn't fully explain their distress. They had fought bravely, seen friends lost, and endured the impossible. Yet what lingered wasn't fear, it was doubt. The propaganda had left emotional shrapnel that medicine couldn't remove. Reports called it homesickness fatigue. Soldiers described it differently, a feeling that home had stopped waiting. But for every story of loss, there were others of remarkable endurance. In Pennsylvania, a woman named Evelyn Moore kept every letter her husband wrote from Italy, more than 100 in total. During the height of the propaganda campaign, she had received one of the forged notes accusing him of infidelity. Instead of believing it, she wrote back, "I don't trust the world, but I trust you." When her husband returned in 1945, they donated their letters to a local museum. Historians later called them a record of faith under siege. Moments like that became the quiet victories of the propaganda war, proof that even when the enemy struck at love itself, not every heart surrendered. Still, the scars were everywhere. The Army's post-war surveys revealed the emotional cost. Morale officers documented hundreds of cases of depression and withdrawal linked directly to the propaganda letters. Commanders noted that units affected by the deception took longer to recover from combat stress. The psychological war had left traces that couldn't be measured in casualties, but in silences. The distance between two people who had once written daily and now struggled to find the right words again. Peter Manning saw those silences firsthand. After the investigation ended, he spent months debriefing returning soldiers and their families for a post-war study. He often sat in small town halls or church basements, listening to people read old letters aloud, real ones and forged ones, side by side. One night in a small auditorium in Illinois, a young veteran handed him a creased envelope. "This one nearly broke me," the man said, "but my wife kept writing until I believed her again." Manning later described that moment as the truest measure of victory, not the destruction of enemy networks, but the restoration of faith between two people who refused to let a lie define them. In archives across the country, boxes of confiscated letters were quietly labeled and stored. They were studied by military psychologists who sought to understand how words could inflict harm without ever drawing blood. Their research led to one of the earliest American studies on psychological resilience under propaganda exposure. From those studies came reforms, stronger communication protocols, verified correspondence systems, and official support programs for military families. The war had taught America that morale wasn't built in speeches or posters. It was built in kitchens and mailrooms, in the quiet moments between letters sent and letters received. Churches and community groups created programs for soldiers' families, not just to share mail, but to share faith in the unseen. The term family readiness would later emerge from these grassroots efforts, forming the foundation of modern military family support. And yet, beneath all the healing, there lingered an uncomfortable truth. The propaganda had worked, if only for a time. It had revealed how fragile even the strongest faith could be when targeted with precision. The war had been fought across continents, but its deepest wounds were emotional. Some children grew up never knowing the full story of why their parents' marriage ended. Some veterans carried unspoken guilt, believing they had doubted too easily. But the country moved forward. The letters that once divided now became lessons, artifacts of an invisible war that had tested the American heart and found it breakable but not broken. In 1947, when Peter Manning testified before a military committee on the effects of psychological warfare, he concluded with a single sentence: "They tried to make us distrust each other. Instead, we learned to defend the truth." The statement was brief, almost understated, but it carried the weight of everything the investigation had uncovered. For every letter of deception, there had been thousands more written in love, honesty, and hope. Those letters, the real ones, outnumbered the fakes 1,000 to 1. The propaganda war had proven something the enemy never understood, that while lies could travel fast, faith could endure longer. The human cost had been heavy, but within it lay the evidence of something stronger: resilience, compassion, and the simple act of believing in one another again. And as the world rebuilt itself after the war, those who had lived through the deception carried a quiet understanding that the hardest battles are not fought for land or victory, but for trust. Trust lost, trust rebuilt, trust kept. It was the invisible triumph, and its price was written in every letter that survived. When the guns fell silent, another truth emerged. The most powerful weapon of the war hadn't been steel or fire, it had been belief. After the victory, Allied intelligence cataloged every captured document from Operation Seduction. The forged letters, false photographs, and propaganda manuals filled entire archives. What began as a rumor in the desert was now evidence of a calculated campaign, a war on trust itself. At the Nuremberg trials, German propagandists were questioned about their methods. They defended their lies as strategy, not cruelty. But for the first time in history, psychological warfare was officially recognized as a weapon, invisible but capable of real harm. In Washington, Peter Manning's investigation became required reading. His findings shaped new intelligence policies and inspired the creation of verified communication systems for military families. Emotional security became a strategic priority because the war had proved that morale was not just spirit, it was strength. Psychologists studied the long-term effects of deception. Their work led to modern military counseling and family readiness programs built to protect soldiers from isolation and manipulation. Academics dissected how the propaganda worked, how partial truths and familiar voices made lies believable. Those studies became early warnings for a new era, one where information itself would be the next battlefield. By the start of the Cold War, psychological operations had a name, a doctrine, and a legacy rooted in lessons learned from the letters of doubt. The files from Operation Seduction now rest in silent archives. Their paper has yellowed, but their message remains clear. The war for truth never ends. As Peter Manning once wrote, "The mind is the final frontier of defense. Guard it well."